And I told you a story about MacCumhail, who was one of the Tuatha de Dannan. She was the goddess of horses. I told you a story about MacCumhail, who was our Hercules. And I want to tell you a story about one of the other cycles in Irish mythology, which is, of course, the Fionn cycle. And Fionn MacCumhail, for those of you who don't know, was the captain of the Fionn. And the Fionn were the army of Ireland. These men were exceptional. The Fionn defended the coastline of Ireland from raiders, but they also watched over the land itself. They were incredibly strong, incredibly smart men. Just to enter the Fionn, just to try and see if you'd be accepted, you had to be able to run through the forest without breaking a single twig. You had to be able to leap your own body height in spears, and you had to be able to recite great tomes of poetry without missing a single word. And that was just to get in. And once you were in the Fionn, you had to spend 5 months of the year living in the wilds training. And then you could go home to your family in the winter time. And Fionn became captain of the Fionn at a very young age. That's a long story that I won't tell you. But when he became captain of the Fionn, he was awarded the Hill of Almain as his home. And he lived there. And in their free time, when the Fionn weren't out defending the shores, they would go out hunting. And one day, Fionn and all the Fionn and their dogs, and Fionn had two very special dogs. One was called Bran and one was called Fionn. And these dogs, again, how they came to be in Fionn's possession is a long-ranging story which I won't go into, but that's just, suffice to say, they weren't just dogs, there was half magic in them. And so Fionn would always go out hunting with his two dogs, and he was out with the Fionn one day, and they hadn't caught anything. And so they had turned and they had started making their way towards the hill of Almain. And the men were tired, and they were dragging their feet, and they were hungry. And suddenly, up ahead on the path, a deer leapt out from a thicket of bushes, and she stood in the path and made sure everybody there got a good look at her before she ran off. And Bran and Fionn were the fastest, they were off after, then all the other dogs of the Fionn, and then Fionn, and then all the other men behind him. But she was so fast. Soon the other dogs had started to follow behind her. It was only Bran and Fionn that were trailing her. And then they lost her scent. And she reappeared further up the path, along the way to the Hill of Almain. And again she stopped, and she looked. And Bran and Fionn saw her, and they were off after her. And soon it was only Bran and Fionn that had her trail. And Fionn saw the two of them disappear into a gathering of trees. And when he entered the gathering of trees, what he saw made his breath stop in his throat. Because the deer was lying on the ground, but not because she was hurt. She was lying there, resting. And Bran and Fionn were running around her like two little puppies, and they were nuzzling her and licking her. And Fionn was watching all of this when he heard the Fionn dogs coming in behind him. And suddenly Bran and Fionn, they leapt up, and they stood guard either side of the deer. Their hackles went up. And all the dogs held back because they knew that Bran and Fionn were by far the two most fearsome of the dogs, and they could kill all of them. So they stood guard as the men of the Fionn came in, and they watched this. And one of the men of the Fionn, MacCumhail, the one-eyed warrior of the Fionn, he came up to Fionn and he said, "What's going on with that deer?" And Fionn said, "Well, Gal, I could be mistaken, but I think she's trying to get to my house." And Gal said, "You think a deer is trying to get into the house of a hunter? That's pretty good, Fionn, that's pretty good." But as he said that, the deer rose up, and she started walking out of the gathering of trees, sure enough making her way towards Almain. And Bran and Fionn on either side of her, so the men, well, they shrugged their shoulders, but they followed. And when they got up to the gates of Almain, she was the first to cross over the threshold. And everybody was talking about this amazing deer and where she had come from, and that night they all gathered for their feast. She curled up by the fire, and Bran and Fionn guarded her flanks. And everyone was so tired they headed off to bed with their full bellies, and Fionn didn't know what to make of it, but he went off to bed and he fell into a deep sleep. And he was awoken in the middle of the night by the most beautiful singing. And he opened his eyes, and he saw, standing in his doorway, this gorgeous, tall, blonde-haired woman in a saffron robe, finer than anything he'd ever seen, with a huge gold clasp. Fionn looked up and said, You're not from Galway, were you?" And she said, "Well, I was welcomed here this afternoon." And Fionn started rubbing his eyes and said, Oh, I'm dreaming. Oh, I'm not going to remember this in the morning." And she says, "You're not dreaming. I was welcomed here this afternoon. I crossed the very threshold in front of you, but you might not recognise me in this form." He said, "What?" She said, when I crossed the threshold, I was a deer. And Fionn stared at her and said, no, I know I'm dreaming. No, she said, listen. My name is Side. I am of the Tuatha de Dannan. And many years ago, a magician of my people tried to force his love upon me, and when I refused him, he transformed me into the shape of a deer. And another one of his slaves took pity on me and told me that if I could find refuge inside the house of Fionn MacCumhail, that I would be transformed back. I have been watching your house for years. I've been waiting until only Bran and Scionn would find me, because only they would recognise my true nature. Today was that day. Well, now Fionn was sitting bolt upright in his bed. Well, you're most welcome here, and you can stay as long as you like as my guest, and no man will ever try and put a bottle upon you, ever. And she said, well, thank you very much. You can just take a room down the hall, if you like. All right, she says. And she did that thing that beautiful women do and know how to do so well. She simply turned, she sashayed down the hall, and Fionn just watched her go. He didn't get much sleep that night. When he woke up the next day, he immediately went to look for her, and she was there, she was real, she hadn't been a dream. And every day thereafter, he found himself mooning around after her, just kind of watching where she was going. And he found himself slowly becoming more and more enchanted by her beauty. Until one day, he knew what had happened. He'd fallen deeply in love, and he knew what he had to do. He went and got the bride cup, mustered all his courage, walked down to her door just as the sun was setting. Knocked on her door, and she opened it. And he said, I was wondering if you would like to raise the bride cup with me.